The room was bright and loud, filled with the clinking of glasses and quiet laughter. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting light like tiny suns. Waiters moved between the guests, carrying silver trays of drinks and small plates of food. Every face in the room seemed polished, dressed in expensive suits and shiny shoes. The air smelled faintly of perfume and candle wax. At the center of all this wealth and laughter stood a man known to everyone there. He was tall, his shoulders broad, and his hair perfectly combed. People called him a millionaire, but more than that, they whispered about his sharp mind and his sharper tongue. He liked to win, and he liked to make sure everyone around him knew it. He had a reputation for being daring. He made bets that seemed impossible, challenges that seemed cruel, and he always won. People feared losing against him, but more than that, they were curious to see what he would do next. Tonight, he had something new in mind. He had seen the room, the crowd, the music, and yet his eyes wandered to one particular corner. It was quiet there. Darker somehow, compared to the rest of the room. And there, sitting like it had been forgotten, was a piano. Its wood was old and scratched. Dust had settled on the edges, and its black and white keys seemed to be begging for attention. Most people had barely noticed it, but he saw it immediately. He smiled, a little cruel, a little curious. The thought that ran through his mind was simple. No one here could touch it. No one could play that piano in a way that would impress him. It had been left alone for years, and it looked tired, as if it had given up on life. He stepped closer, his polished shoes making soft sounds on the marble floor. The chatter around him seemed to dim in his presence. People followed him with their eyes, not wanting to be rude, but unable to look away. Everyone here is talented. I am sure, he said, his voice carrying across the room. But let me show you something fun. Let's see who here can play that old piano and actually make me feel something. He gestured toward the piano. His eyes sparkled with challenge, and a small, cruel smile played on his lips. I will bet $100,000 that no one can do it. No one can touch this piano in a way that will move me. A hush fell over the room. Guests looked at each other, unsure who would respond. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others whispered that it was impossible, that the piano had been broken too long, that its sound could never be more than a scratchy echo. But the millionaire only laughed softly, clearly enjoying the attention, clearly enjoying the thought of proving everyone wrong. He placed a thick envelope of money on the piano. The paper glimmered under the chandelier light. This is not charity, he said. This is a bet. A real one. Anyone thinks they can do it? For a moment, the room was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath. Most people wanted to avoid the embarrassment that came with trying and failing in front of the richest man in the room. A few brave souls stepped forward, pressing their fingers on the keys, but the sound they made was weak, empty, and hollow. The millionaire shook his head, smiling. No, that won't do, he said. His voice was calm but sharp, like glass breaking. This piano deserves more than that. You need to make me feel something. Make me forget myself for a moment. Make me forget the money, the luxury, the everything. Some guests laughed nervously. Others frowned. One man muttered to himself, "It's just a piano. Why is he making such a big deal?" The millionaire did not answer. He simply walked around the piano slowly, letting his eyes sweep over the room. His gaze was sharp, almost predatory. He loved this part. The tension, the fear, the anticipation. He wanted someone to fail. He wanted someone to struggle. He wanted to be the one standing above them all. Then, almost as if by accident, someone stepped forward. A person no one had noticed before. Their clothes were simple, clean but not fancy. Their shoes were plain, their hair ordinary. They looked around the room nervously, but there was a calm in their eyes, a quiet determination. The millionaire raised an eyebrow, amused. He could not hide his smirk. "Ah, someone with courage," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Or perhaps someone who does not know what they are doing. Either way, this will be entertaining." The person approached the piano slowly. Their hands hovered over the keys for a moment, almost unsure, almost trembling. But then they pressed a single key. It was soft, almost timid. The millionaire leaned forward, clearly unimpressed. "Is that all?" he asked. The stranger did not answer. They simply sat down and took a deep breath, their eyes closing for a moment. When they opened them again, there was focus. There was memory. There was something deeper than talent showing in their gaze. The room watched in silence. Some people shifted in their chairs, others held their breath. The millionaire chuckled softly, leaning on the piano. He had seen many performances in his life. He had heard countless musicians play in concert halls, in theaters, even in his private mansion. He had never been moved easily. But he did enjoy the show. He liked to watch people try and fail. He liked to see pride and hope crash against reality. The stranger began to play. The first notes were slow, hesitant, almost shaky. But there was honesty in them, a rawness that the room had not expected. The sound filled the air, soft at first, careful, like someone testing the waters. The millionaire raised an eyebrow. He was intrigued, but he would not show it. He straightened his back, pretending to check his watch, pretending to glance around the room. But everyone noticed the change in the piano. It was not perfect, it was not polished, but it was alive. The notes carried something real, something human, something that money and status could never buy. As the stranger played, the music began to flow more confidently. The notes rose and fell like a conversation. They spoke of struggles, of late nights, of hope and fear. The crowd started to lean forward. They could feel something in the music. They could feel emotion that had nothing to do with wealth or fame. Some faces softened. Some eyes glistened. The millionaire frowned slightly. He had heard many performers, but this was different. It was not technical perfection that touched him. It was honesty. It was life itself, hidden in the worn keys of a forgotten piano. People began to whisper to each other. "Who is that?" one guest asked quietly. "I don't know," another replied, "but listen to the way they play. It's incredible." The stranger did not look up. They simply played, letting the music guide their hands. Every note seemed intentional, full of purpose, full of meaning. The millionaire watched, confused. He could not place why he felt so unsettled. He had money, power, influence. He had seen greatness before, many times. Yet something in this moment made him pause. Something in this piano, in this music, in this quiet person, reached him in a way he did not expect. Time passed, but no one noticed. The music continued, flowing like a river, soft and strong, gentle and forceful. It told stories of forgotten days, of moments when people had nothing but hope to hold on to. The room that had been filled with laughter and chatter became still. The only sound was the piano and the emotion that it carried. The millionaire, who had expected to dominate and control, found himself silent, watching, feeling. Finally, the last note hung in the air. It faded slowly like a whisper. The room remained silent, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Soft at first, then louder, until the room was filled with applause. Some people were crying quietly. Some were smiling with awe. And in the center of it all, the millionaire stood frozen. He looked at the stranger, at the piano, at the money on the table, and realized something. This was not about winning or losing. This was not about wealth or pride. This was about something far more powerful. For the first time in a long time, he felt humble. He felt small, in a good way. He felt respect. The strangers stood quietly, their hands resting on the keys, their breathing steady. They did not seek attention. They did not seek praise. They had simply shared something that belonged to them alone, and in doing so, they had changed the room, even him. The millionaire walked over slowly. He picked up the envelope of money, opened it, and then paused. He looked at the stranger and smiled. A real smile this time. It was not cruel. It was not mocking. It was honest. He realized that the bet he had made was not about winning anymore. It was about witnessing something extraordinary in someone no one had noticed. And that, he knew, was worth far more than money. The room was still buzzing from the music. But now attention shifted from the piano to the person who had just played it. Everyone stared, some with curiosity, some with awe. The stranger's calm presence seemed to contrast with the chaos around them. Their hands rested lightly on the keys, the kind of hands that had known work and struggle, not luxury and comfort. The millionaire, who had expected a brief amusement, now found himself looking closer, noticing details he had ignored before: the quiet strength in the stranger's posture, the steady breath, the way they seemed completely unaware of the crowd. People started whispering again, trying to guess who this person was. Some thought they must be a secret prodigy, trained from childhood in the finest music schools. Others guessed they had connections no one knew about, perhaps famous in another country or city. But as the whispers grew, the stranger did not move. They looked down at the piano, as if it were an old friend they had not seen for years. There was no pride, no demand for attention, just a quiet understanding between themselves and the instrument. The millionaire, still standing near the piano, cleared his throat. He wanted to speak, to break the silence, but he could not. His usual confidence felt strange in this room now. He had seen people perform countless times, but this had been different. It was not technique that impressed him. It was honesty. The raw truth of someone's life poured into sound. He realized he wanted to know more. Who was this person? How had they learned to play like that on an old, worn-out piano that most people would ignore? The stranger finally looked up, their eyes meeting his for a moment. There was no fear, no arrogance, only a quiet curiosity. The millionaire leaned forward slightly, asking, "Tell me, where did you learn to play like that?" The stranger smiled softly, almost shyly. They did not answer immediately. Instead, they glanced at the piano, then back at the millionaire, as if deciding what to reveal first. "I learned a long time ago," the stranger began. "Not in schools or in concert halls. I learned where I could find an old piano and enough time to practice without anyone bothering me. I learned on broken keys, on pianos that were forgotten by everyone but me. I played because I had to, because it was the only way to feel free sometimes." Their voice was soft, steady, and sincere. People around the room began to listen closely, leaning forward in their chairs. The millionaire raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. He had always believed talent was something you could buy or arrange, something that could be polished with money and connections. But now, hearing the story, he felt a flicker of doubt. This person had not had money, not had luxury, not had fame, and yet they had learned to create beauty that could stop a room full of people in their tracks. He wanted to know more, the stranger continued. They spoke of a small, crowded apartment where the only sound in the mornings was the creak of the floor and the distant voices of neighbors. Their first piano had been borrowed from a friend who no longer needed it. Its keys were sticky, some of them broken, but it was enough. It was all they had. They would spend hours every day pressing the keys, listening to the sounds, trying again and again until something felt right. Sometimes the music was harsh, sometimes it was gentle, but it was always theirs. Life had not been easy. Money was scarce. There were nights without enough food, days filled with work that left their hands sore and tired. School had been a challenge because the family could not afford extras. Still, the piano had been a refuge. It was a place where nothing else mattered, where pain, fear, and exhaustion could transform into something meaningful. They remembered nights sitting by the window, playing softly while rain tapped against the glass, imagining a world far beyond their cramped apartment, a world full of possibilities. The guests in the room began to understand something. This was not a trained performer. This was someone who had learned through struggle, through patience, through determination that had nothing to do with wealth or privilege. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably. He had always thought success was about strategy, about having resources, about knowing the right people. But now he was faced with proof that raw human determination, coupled with passion, could create something greater than money could buy. The stranger's voice softened, almost wistful. "I did not play for anyone tonight. I played because I love it. Because when I'm at the piano, nothing else matters." The world stops. My worries stop. I am just me. They paused, letting the words sink in. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint echo of the piano's last notes. Even the millionaire's eyes softened slightly, and he found himself leaning against the piano, listening, feeling something unfamiliar as the stranger spoke. People began to notice small details about them. The calluses on their fingers, not from piano lessons but from work. The quiet confidence that had grown from years of proving oneself alone. The way their eyes seemed to reflect both pain and hope. Like someone who had survived life's storms and still found joy in simple things. It was clear that the music had not come from privilege or training, but from life itself. Someone in the crowd asked quietly, "How did you find the courage to play here in front of everyone?" The stranger smiled gently. "I didn't think about courage. I thought about the piano. I thought about the music. I thought about how it feels when you play something real. Everything else fades away. If I am lucky, people might feel it too." The crowd murmured softly. They could feel it. They could feel the honesty in those words. The humility in the presence. The millionaire who had made the bet realized something. He had intended to mock, to entertain, to show that wealth and judgment were superior. But instead, he had witnessed something beyond money. Something human. Something that could not be bought. He glanced around the room, seeing the faces of his guests. Some were teary-eyed. Some were silent, stunned by what they had heard. And he realized that the stranger had given them more than music. They had given them a glimpse of life, struggle, and of triumph in its purest form. The stranger continued their story. They spoke of teachers who had refused to take them seriously, peers who laughed at their dreams, of countless nights where they wanted to give up. But every time they returned to the piano, every time they found something new to express, something new to learn. It was not easy, but it was theirs. The struggle had shaped the music, had shaped them. And now, here they were, playing for a room full of strangers, sharing that journey through the sound of old worn keys. The millionaire found himself fascinated. He had never been confronted with talent like this talent, born not of opportunity, but of persistence, of hardship, of love for something greater than oneself. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand every moment that had led to this. He realized that no amount of money could have created this music. He realized that no instruction, no privilege could have produced this authenticity. It had to come from the heart, from life lived fully, even in struggle. Guests began to clap quietly again. Not out of obligation, but from genuine appreciation. Some wiped tears from their eyes, some smiled in wonder. The room that had been filled with wealth and chatter now felt different, lighter, more human. The stranger had reminded them that life was not about money or appearances, but about passion, resilience, and honesty. The stranger stood, closing the piano gently. They looked around the room one last time, not with pride, but with quiet satisfaction. They had shared their story through music. They had connected with people not through wealth or fame, but through something deeper. And in that moment, even the millionaire understood that true greatness often hides in silence. In struggle, and in places where no one is looking, the millionaire, still holding the envelope of money, took a deep breath. He realized that this was not just about a bet anymore. This was about respect, about seeing the value in someone who had fought for every note, every moment, every opportunity, and for the first time he felt humility, feeling he had long ignored in his pursuit of wealth and power. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the air felt different. People spoke softly, glancing at the piano and the stranger with a new sense of understanding. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something real, and for the stranger, it was just another step in a journey that had been years in the making. They had played not for applause, not for money, but for the music, for the story, for life itself. And somehow, that had been enough to touch an entire room and even a millionaire. The evening continued, but the memory of those notes lingered. Guests would talk about it for years, not because of the bet, not because of the money, but because of the honesty, the courage, and the human spirit that had spoken through the piano. And the stranger, quietly leaving the room later, carried with them a sense of peace. Knowing that their music had reached hearts in a way nothing else ever could, the piano had been silent for a few moments, but the energy in the room was far from gone. Everyone present was still feeling the echo of the music that had just filled the space. The strangers in the crowd whispered softly, glancing at one another, their faces showing awe and curiosity. The millionaire who had placed the bet stood near the piano, his hands on the edge of the polished wood. He had expected a display, a performance that might amuse him for a few minutes. Instead, he had experienced something deeper, something he could not define. The stranger, the one who had captured the room without intending to, sat down again. Their movements were calm, deliberate, as if they were not playing for anyone but themselves. Yet somehow everyone could feel the power in their presence. The piano, old and worn, seemed to respond to the touch of these hands in a way it never had before. The first note they played was gentle, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that drew the listeners in. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for someone like this to awaken it. As the stranger continued, the music began to grow. It was no longer just notes and rhythm. It became a story, each key telling a piece of life, each chord a memory transformed into sound. The millionaire found himself leaning closer, listening more intently than had ever listened to any performer in his life. He had always thought talent could be measured by technique, by speed, by complexity. But this was different. This was honesty expressed in its purest form. The room grew quiet. Conversations stopped, glasses were lowered, and even the waiters paused as if time had slowed. The music told stories that words could not. It spoke of nights when the stranger had sat alone in a small, dark room, listening to the rain while fingers pressed the keys of broken pianos. It spoke of mornings where there was barely enough to eat, but still enough courage to play. It spoke of hope, fear, loss, and the unyielding desire to create something beautiful in the face of hardship. Some people felt tears welling up in their eyes. They had not expected to feel so moved by someone they did not know, someone without fame or wealth or training in grand institutions. The music seemed to reach into their memories, stirring emotions they had long forgotten. There was laughter in some notes, sadness in others, and a quiet strength running through the melody that made it impossible to look away. Even the millionaire, who had seen and owned so much, felt a lump in his throat. He realized something he had never considered before. Wealth and power could not create this. Connections and privilege could not produce this. What he was hearing was life itself, expressed through the piano. The stranger had lived every note, breathed it, felt it, and now they were sharing it with everyone in the room. It was raw, imperfect, and perfect at the same time. The sound seemed to touch corners of the heart that money could never reach. The music changed, slowly, shifting from gentle, flowing melodies to something more urgent, more powerful. The stranger's hands moved faster, but not recklessly. Each note was intentional, each chord precise in its emotion. It was as if they were telling a story of struggle and triumph, of falling and rising again. Some guests covered their faces with their hands, trying to hide tears. Others leaned forward in their chairs, completely absorbed. The millionaire, whose life had always been about control, realized he had none in this moment. He could only listen, only feel, only try to understand the power of what he was witnessing. There was a quiet beauty in the way the stranger played. It was not flashy, not showy, but every note carried meaning. The room, filled with people who were used to luxury and entertainment, was now captivated by simplicity and honesty. They could sense that the stranger's life had been difficult, that every challenge had shaped their music, had shaped their soul, and yet, despite everything, there was joy in the sound, a light that refused to be extinguished. The millionaire glanced around at the guests. Their faces reflected the same astonishment he felt. Some were crying quietly. Some had their mouths open, stunned. None of them had expected this. He realized that no bet, no sum of money, could ever match the value of this moment. The stranger was not playing for applause or recognition. They were playing because they had to, because the piano was a part of them, a voice for emotions too deep to express with words. As the music reached its peak, the stranger's fingers danced across the keys with a mix of power and grace. The sound filled every corner of the room, echoing off the chandeliers, reverberating through the walls, and somehow penetrating the hearts of everyone present. The millionaire felt a strange sensation, as if the music were peeling away layers of pride and arrogance he had worn for years. He felt small, humbled, and yet grateful to witness something so pure. The melody slowed, becoming tender and soft. It was a gentle lullaby of reflection, a reminder of the struggles that everyone carries in silence. Guests shifted in their seats, some closing their eyes, some holding on to their loved ones nearby. The music was no longer just sound. It was an experience, a shared connection between the stranger and everyone in the room. The piano, once ignored and forgotten, had become a bridge between hearts. Finally, the last note lingered, hanging in the air like a held breath. Silence followed, deep and heavy, as if the room collectively acknowledged the weight of what had just been shared. The millionaire, still standing by the piano, felt his hands tremble slightly. He had placed a bet, thinking he would see entertainment. Instead, he had witnessed a miracle. The stranger had turned a simple instrument into a vessel of human emotion, and nothing in his wealth or power could rival that. The crowd began to respond, slowly at first, then louder. Applause filled the room, clapping and cheers mingling with tears and smiles. But the reaction was not just about talent or performance. It was about life, about struggle, about hope, about triumph against odds. The stranger stood quietly, acknowledging the response with a gentle nod, their humility shining through every movement. They had given themselves fully, without expectation, and in doing so, they had left an impression that would not fade. The millionaire stepped forward, slowly, holding the envelope of money. He felt an unfamiliar mix of emotions, respect, humility, and a strange desire to understand this person. He had made the bet expecting to control the situation, to assert his superiority. Now he realized that control was irrelevant. He had witnessed something far greater than money could ever buy. Something that came from the heart, from life itself, from years of perseverance and dedication. He placed the envelope gently on the piano, more as a gesture of acknowledgement than a payment. The stranger looked at it but did not reach for it. Their eyes met his, and for a moment there was understanding. Money had nothing to do with this moment. Respect, empathy, and the sharing of human experience had everything to do with it. The millionaire felt a shift within himself, a recognition that true greatness was not always visible, not always loud, and not always owned. Sometimes it was quiet, lived in struggle, and expressed in ways that could not be bought. People in the room continued to speak softly, praising the stranger, asking questions, wanting to know more. The stranger answered modestly, sharing small parts of their life and lessons they had learned along the way. They spoke of patience, of resilience, of finding joy in small victories. The crowd listened intently, realizing that the story behind the music was just as powerful as the music itself. The millionaire stepped back, watching. He realized that this encounter was teaching him something he had long ignored. Money could provide comfort, power could provide influence. Neither could replace the depth of human experience, the power of honesty, or the strength of determination. The stranger had reminded him of something he had forgotten in his pursuit of wealth. A reminder that the greatest treasures in life are often intangible, lived through struggle, and shared with others in moments of vulnerability. As the evening continued, the stranger remained near the piano, allowing others to play, to explore, to try, but always gently guiding the keys when needed. It was clear that this was not about fame or attention for them. It was about connection, about sharing something that had been years in the making. Guests left the room that night, not only impressed, but changed in some small way, carrying with them the echo of music, the story of resilience, and the reminder that greatness can be found in the most unexpected places. The millionaire, who had begun the evening confident and sure, left with a new perspective. He had intended to assert power and witness failure, but instead he had witnessed human triumph. He realized that true wealth was not counted in dollars, but in experiences, in understanding, And in the moments when one could witness genuine talent and emotion, the stranger, quietly leaving the piano behind, knew that this was only the beginning of a journey. The music had reached hearts that night, and the story it told would not fade quickly. It was more than a performance, it was a reminder that even in a world full of wealth, power, and expectation, human emotion, honesty, and determination could still create miracles. And so, the room that had once been filled with chatter and luxury was now filled with something far more valuable, a sense of connection, a spark of inspiration, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the simplest actions like pressing the keys of a worn piano could change lives forever. The applause had slowly faded. But the room did not return to the chatter and laughter of earlier. There was a different energy now, a quiet weight that lingered in the air. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering softly, glancing at one another with wide eyes. Everyone had been touched by the music, but no one more than the millionaire. He remained near the piano, staring at the envelope of money he had placed there earlier. What had started as a bet, a game of amusement and pride, now felt strangely hollow in comparison to what he had just witnessed. He looked at the stranger, who was standing quietly, their hands resting gently on the piano keys. There was no boastfulness in their posture, no expectation of praise or recognition, just calm, quiet strength. He realized that the person before him had lived a life of challenges and hardship, yet had created beauty that reached into the hearts of everyone in the room. The millionaire, who had always measured life and success, influence, and wealth, felt a stirring in him he had not experienced before. He took a deep breath, trying to regain the sense of control he had always relied upon. But it was no use. The feeling of humility, of awe, was too strong. He had intended to dominate, to challenge, to show that his wealth and judgment were superior. Instead, he had been forced to confront something far greater, the raw power of human resilience and honesty. He could see it reflected in the faces of the guests, in the tearful smiles, in the softened expressions. The stranger had done what no amount of money could ever achieve. He had moved people in a way that transcended status, luxury, and pretense. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. The familiar sense of authority and superiority that usually guided him seemed to falter. He realized that this was not about winning or losing. The bet no longer mattered. The envelope of money he had placed on the piano felt meaningless. What mattered was what had just happened, the connection, the honesty, the undeniable talent and courage of someone who had struggled quietly. Unseen for years, he approached the stranger slowly, his steps careful. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, but he did not care. He wanted to speak, to understand, to acknowledge the significance of what he had just witnessed. You have no idea what you just did," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. The stranger looked up, their eyes calm and steady. There was no arrogance, no expectation, only the quiet patience of someone who had spent years waiting to be understood. "I played," the stranger said simply, "because I had to, because it is who I am." Their voice was soft but clear, and it carried a weight that the millionaire could not ignore. It was not a challenge, not a boast, just a statement of truth. The millionaire nodded slowly, realizing that this was exactly why the music had affected him so deeply. It had not been performance for applause. It had been performance for life itself. He felt an unfamiliar mixture of respect and remorse. He had come to this room thinking he could control the situation, that he could use money and pride to entertain himself. Instead, he had been humbled by someone who had never sought power, never sought recognition, and yet had achieved something far beyond what wealth or status could provide. The millionaire's mind raced. He thought about the years he had spent chasing success, the deals he had made, the victories he had celebrated, and for the first time he wondered if he had overlooked what really mattered. The guests were now fully attentive, sensing that something important was happening. The millionaire turned to the crowd, his voice firm but reflective. "I made a bet tonight," he said. "I believed that money, influence, and judgment could measure talent, that I could judge what was worthy and what was not. but I have just learned something very different. What you just saw, what you just heard, cannot be measured by wealth, by education, or by status. It is far greater than that." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room remained quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft shuffling of guests in their chairs. "I want everyone here to understand," he continued, "that the true measure of a person is not what they own, or what they can buy, or even how polished their skills appear. It is what they carry inside, the struggles they have faced, the honesty they bring, and the courage to share it with the world." The stranger listened, their calm presence a contrast to the millionaire's usual intensity. They had never expected this, had never sought validation, and yet they felt the weight of acknowledgement in the room. They had shared their music for themselves, for the piano, for life itself. And now it was being recognized in a way that went beyond applause. The millionaire stepped closer to the piano. He looked at the envelope of money again, then back at the stranger. "I owe you more than this," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "This bet, this challenge was foolish of me. It was meant to entertain, but it has humbled me. You deserve more than recognition, more than applause. You deserve the chance to reach the world with what you do." The stranger's eyes widened slightly, not in greed or surprise, but in a quiet acknowledgement of respect. They had never expected such an offer. They had survived through hardship, relying on their own determination and love for music. And now someone who had long believed money and power were the highest forms of value was offering them support. But there was no arrogance in their response. It's only gratitude and humility. "I appreciate your words," the stranger said softly. "But I do not play for recognition or reward. I play because I have to. The piano has been my companion through everything. If my music reaches people, that is a gift. I do not need more than that." Their voice carried sincerity that touched everyone listening, including the millionaire. The room seemed to hold its breath. The guests sensed a shift, something rare and powerful. They had come expecting entertainment, but they were witnessing transformation of music, of hearts, and of a man who had long relied on wealth as a measure of value. The millionaire, who had thought himself untouchable, felt the full weight of his own assumptions crumble. He stepped back, looking at the stranger with newfound understanding. "You have taught me something I did not know I needed to learn," he said. "Talent is not in certificates, not in applause, not in money. It is in life itself, in struggle, in perseverance, and in courage. Tonight, you have reminded me of that truth, and for that, I am grateful." Some guests began to murmur softly, nodding in agreement. They were witnessing a rare moment of humility from a man who had always seemed untouchable. They realized that the power of the stranger's music had not only moved them, but had begun to shift the perspective of someone used to measuring life in terms of success and wealth. The millionaire then made a decision, one that surprised even himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, typing a quick note. He wanted to ensure that this person's talent would not be overlooked again. He wanted to help provide opportunities, platforms, and support, not as charity, but as respect for what had been accomplished through life and struggle alone. The stranger noticed, but did not comment. They had learned long ago that true recognition did not require immediate acknowledgement. It came from consistency, honesty, and the quiet work done behind the scenes. And yet the gesture was meaningful. It showed that even someone so accustomed to measuring life in money and influence could recognize value where it mattered most. The crowd began to relax, some stepping forward to speak with the stranger, to learn more about their story, to ask questions about their journey. The stranger responded with gentle patience, explaining small moments of hardship, small victories, and the love for music that had carried them through. Each story deepened the impact of the previous performance, showing that greatness is often hidden in the quiet corners of life, nurtured by persistence rather than applause. The millionaire watched all of this, feeling a strange sense of pride, not pride in himself, but pride in recognizing and supporting something extraordinary. He had learned that money and status could not create the depth of experience that shaped this person. But he could provide opportunity, and that mattered. Not as control, not as dominance, but as acknowledgement of true talent and courage. As the night continued, the atmosphere remained charged with energy and reflection. Guests discussed the performance, the story, and the lessons it had brought. The stranger remained modest, answering questions, but never claiming credit, always redirecting the focus to the music and the journey that had brought them here. The millionaire stayed near the piano, observing, listening, learning, and slowly letting go of the assumptions that had guided his life for so long. By the end of the evening, something remarkable had happened. What began as a bet, a challenge intended to entertain, had transformed into a lesson in humility, respect, and human connection. The millionaire realized that wealth and power could never replace authenticity, honesty, and courage. The stranger had reminded everyone in the room that true greatness often lives in the unseen, the unrecognized, and the quiet moments of perseverance. And in that realization, the millionaire felt something he had rarely experienced: gratitude. Gratitude for having witnessed something extraordinary, for having been reminded of what truly matters, for the opportunity to honor talent and courage in a way that went far beyond money. The stranger had played for life itself, and in doing so, had changed everyone who had listened, including him. The room had quieted now, the last echoes of the piano notes lingering in the air like a gentle memory. People were still moving slowly, reluctant to break the spell that had been woven through the music. Some whispered to each other, sharing how they had felt when the melody rose and fell, how it had brought back memories they thought they had forgotten. The millionaire stood near the piano, his hands folded in front of him, his usual confidence replaced by thoughtfulness. He had expected a bet to entertain, but he had received a lesson in humility and humanity instead. The stranger remained calm, standing by the piano with a quiet dignity. They had shared their story, their music, and their heart without expectation. Yet now, everyone in the room seemed to recognize that what they had done went far beyond a performance. It had touched lives, shifted perspectives, and reminded people of the power of courage, persistence, and honesty. The millionaire watched, realizing that this moment was more valuable than any deal, any investment, or any sum of money he had ever earned.